Introductions and the excavation of my past, which I will not disavow. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a cold, so if you can't hear me in the back, just let me know and I'll try and project more.
Or just come forward.
Just so, narcissistic selves in the age of Trump. It's a commonplace that the American self has become, over the past 4 or 5 decades, increasingly narcissistic, greedy, selfish, grandiose, self-indulgent, and entitled. Where we were once self-controlled, now we are self-indulgent, unable to resist the siren call of consumption and consumer culture. Where we were once self-reliant, sturdy, independent bourgeois selves, dependent on no one and nothing external to ourselves, now we are increasingly dependent on others. Pale simulacra of the 19th century's modal, sovereign, autarkic self. Too much self-esteem and too little self-discipline have yielded us a panoply of narcissistic types, from shopaholic women to abs-obsessed men, from charismatic CEOs, and think here of Steve Jobs, to philandering politicians, and the list of these is impossibly long. Think for starters of Bill Clinton and of course Trump. From selfie-taking millennials to their Botox-injecting older counterparts worshiping at the fountain of youth. And here, this narcissistic figure entered the public sphere in the 1970s, the aptly christened me decade, and has proven irresistible to pundits, cultural commentators, and assorted other moralists ever since. Popularized in Christopher Lasch's best-selling book, The Culture of Narcissism, which appeared in 1978, he, or more often she, has found more contemporary fame in the work of 2 psychologists. The book they published in 2009, The Narcissism Epidemic, here's Lasch, and then The Narcissism Epidemic, Living in an Age of Entitlement. This book argues that once again, like in the 1970s, narcissism is dangerously on the increase and visible everywhere, most especially among the individualistic, self-seeking, and self-promoting young, who the authors claim constitute the most narcissistic generation in history. Hundreds of popular articles, as well as a slew of publications in psychology journals, warn of the dangers this generation of entitled youth present to the body politic. This is the narcissistic self of modernity, exemplified by Generation Facebook, Instagram, selfie, and so on. This narcissism of this figure is pretty straightforward and easy to characterize. It's basically the equivalent of having an exaggeratedly high opinion of oneself, an inflated, disproportionately big ego. And here we have Narcissist in Chief, how Trump's ego reflects U.S. culture. It denotes selfishness, entitlement, and unwarranted self-esteem. In pop terms, it's thinking too highly of oneself. It's easily measured by a 40-question test, the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, which has been administered to tens of thousands of subjects and is readily available on the internet. And here's just a few of the questions. I think, look at question 12, which I think is particularly interesting. I like to have authority over other people, which obviously you're a narcissist, or I don't mind following orders. It's like, how did they come up with these questions? Yet, what a difference an election can make. Since Donald Trump won the U.S. presidency, the discussion of narcissism has shifted significantly. No longer is it the millennial who won't move out of his parents' basement who occupies the headlines. And now our concerns about the selfie stick, the millennial's weapon of choice, seem positively quaint when the narcissist in chief's weapon of choice is the bomb. So selfie stick, perfect accoutrement of the digital narcissist, 2014. Have we reached peak narcissism with the selfie stick? You don't read that much about selfie sticks anymore. I tried to do an engram, but they end in 2000, so I couldn't do that. Now that times have turned darker and that media attention has turned from the rise of self-esteem to the risk of fascism, all this focus on millennials' sense of entitlement seems a bit precious. It wasn't the narcissistic young who brought us Trump. If the election of Trump has had any silver lining, thin as it is, It's that the silliness about narcissism, has largely stopped as the public conversation about the narcissistic self has taken a serious turn. To borrow from and paraphrase Marx, from the farce of the threat posed by Generation Me to the tragedy of a malignant narcissist in the White House and what that means for the rest of us. So today I'm going to talk about narcissistic selves. And this has been a major thread in social criticism, encompassing a number of allied American and other selves: the empty self, the consuming self, the greedy self, the unsatisfied self, the unsatisfiable self, and so on. I'm going to talk about four things. First, I'm going to propose that Trump is indeed a narcissist, surprise, that he fits all the criteria of the diagnosis, whether these criteria come from diagnostic and statistical manual style descriptive psychiatry, psychoanalysis, or more popular construals. Second, I'll argue that we can't understand Trump without appreciating the appeal of his narcissism, the ways in which he mobilizes his own narcissism to connect with his followers. Then I'll briefly explore the narcissistic dimensions of the phenomenon, or one dimension of the phenomenon Trump represents, of the businessman, CEO, president, emphasizing narcissism's culturally valued upsides. And then I'll conclude with a plea for a more nuanced understanding of narcissism. If the concept's to be of any use analytically, we need to think about it in its several dimensions, not just as an epithet or as a synonym for any number of selfish behaviors. So let me start by first briefly outlining, well, here's the thread of the bomb. The DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, features of narcissistic personality disorder. These will be familiar, exaggerated sense of self, thinking of oneself as superior, preoccupied with fantasies of success, power, brilliance, believing you're superior, requiring constant admiration, entitled, expecting favors, exploiting others, lack of empathy, inability or unwillingness to recognize the feelings of others, immense envy, and also believing that others envy you, and behaving arrogantly. The long-standing question of whether Donald Trump is a narcissist has, over the course of the last year, become ever more urgent. It has spawned countless news articles, as well as a raft of amateur diagnosticians who confidently assert that he is. Grandiose, entitled, arrogant, and hungry for admiration, Trump appears to many the very embodiment of the malignant narcissist, a world-class exemplar of this miserable personality type, the greatest narcissistic president that God ever created. He has long envisioned himself a king, a ruler of the world, according to second wife Marla Maples, and now he actually is. Though whether he is more George III, as he's been portrayed by MSNBC in The New Republic, than Henry VIII, which is how The Economist and Newsweek have cast him, is an open question. Favoring the latter is a steady stream of reports leaked from the White House suggesting that it's gone full Tudor court with rampant backstabbing, treachery, and organized paranoia. And I was just reading this morning a tidbit in Michael Wolff's new book, reporting that Steve Bannon had bragged about being the Cromwell of Trump's court. I think forgetting that Cromwell ends up, which is in the process of happening, it appears, but who knows. Labeling Trump a narcissist is nothing new. Rather, it's long been a preoccupation of media commentators. And I went back through the analytic literature and from 1990 on, and he actually appears in the literature as a King Donald, a mafia don, a con man, psychopath, a pompous bully, and so on. A year before the election, the magazine Vanity Fair posed the question of whether Trump is actually a narcissist, drawing on therapists' assessments to present a psychological profile of what they called this strange individual. The magazine argued he was a textbook case, classic, and a dream come true for students of narcissistic manipulativeness. He was, in the experts' estimation, very easy to diagnose. 9 months later, the conservative commentator and psychiatrist Charles Krauthammer judged Trump's behavior beyond narcissism, indicative of his primitive need for adoration and his craving for the approval and praise that assure him of how loved and admired he is. 2 weeks before Election Day, a clinical psychologist writing on CNN.com pointed yet again to Trump's narcissism, this time focusing on his ever-present need for praise, his impulsivity, and in the face of the slightest dissension, his uncontrolled rage. And post-election, a Guardian opinion writer, starting from the premise of Trump's narcissism, turned to his magnetic hold on his followers, casting them as so many victims of domestic abuse and bullying, and arguing, somewhat dubiously to my mind, that not in politics, but in massive, high-quality psychological intervention was the remedy for Trumpism to be found. We are a long way here from the inflated ego interpretation of Trump's narcissism with such articles. Characterizing Trump as a pathological narcissist in this mold, which to be clear I think he is, can help us understand the relentlessness of his need to prevail over everyone and everything. Indeed, it can also make sense of his love of the chase, his self-admitted tendency, once he's gotten what he's wanted, to be left feeling bored by it. The same assets that excite me in the chase often, once they are gone, leave me bored, he said in 1990, which implicitly raises the question of whether the presidency, the ultimate asset, will also prove less exciting in the having than in the pursuing. This highlights the paradox of the manifest worldly power, the wealth, real estate, women, and now the most powerful office on earth, and his insecurities and overweening fear of humiliation. 2 days post-election, Trump was tweeting that it was very unfair that protesters were out in force. Within less than a week, he was ranting about the New York Times' bad coverage of his campaign on Twitter. Such complaints have continued and have become a defining aspect of his presidency. In the DSM, the paradoxes of narcissism, that is, the power on the one hand and the insecurities on the other, these paradoxes are relegated to an addendum of so-called associated features, among them the narcissist's vulnerability to injury and humiliation and intolerance of criticism, all of which is openly in display in Trump's actions. There's no need to delve into some kind of interior here. The DSM, having implicitly pointed to the paradox, then offers us no tools with which to understand it. With Trump, one is struck by his inflated self-concept on the one hand and inordinate need for tribute from others on the other. His testimonials to his own greatness are close to hand. I'll just read you a few. I know more about ISIS than the generals do, believe me. Nobody knows jobs like I do. I know more about foreign policy than anybody running. Nobody reads the Bible more than me. Nobody knows about trade more than me. I've studied the Iran deal in great detail. I can actually say far greater by far than anyone else. I know more about renewables than any human being on earth. Nobody knows more about taxes than I do, maybe in the history of the world. I understand money better than anybody. Nobody in the history of this country has ever known so much about infrastructure as Donald Trump, speaking of himself in the third person. I have some of the best websites in the world. It turned out to be probably, by anybody's count, the biggest selling business book of all time. There's never been a business book that sold like Trump, The Art of the Deal. So nobody, but nobody, does self-aggrandizement better than Donald Trump. Coupled with this swaggering bombast is an equally spectacular need for adulation, a need so great that Trump embarked on a post-election, what he called victory tour, holding large rallies in friendly states, and has staged cabinet meetings in which loyalists obsequiously testified to the leader's greatness. And this is the most recent example, like a cringe-inducing. Just Google it and you can watch. Just a week ago, he tweeted a video self-tribute, as it was characterized in the media, that cites his success in office, saying, "What a year it's been, and we're just getting started. Together we are," in all caps, "making America great again." Think about this for a moment. The President of the United States, the most powerful man on the planet, can't get enough of the intoxications of celebrity. A man who doesn't smoke or drink, but who is addicted to the crowd's love. The New York Times reports he likes the gratification and adulation that the cheering crowds provide, and his aides are discussing how they might accommodate his demand. I have the biggest crowds, he told Fox News in August 2016. Nobody's ever had crowds like this. In Cincinnati, relieving the glories of the campaign trail, he told the crowd, I love this stuff. I love it. 9 months before the election, a New York Times columnist wrote of being transfixed watching a Trump rally, which featured his asking those present to raise their hands heavenward in a pledge of fealty to him. He was transfixed by Trump's epic neediness, by the scope and intensity of his hunger for adulation. It's bottomless, insatiable. What drives Trump, as this Times columnist sees it, is the sound of his name uttered by pundits, rivals, and crowds. In Trump world, no slight too minor, no validation suffices. In 1991, he even went so far as to impersonate a publicist for Trump, calling this persona John Miller or John Barron, when speaking to a reporter, saying of his boss, that is Trump saying of his boss Trump, that he's a good guy, before going on to brag of women wanting to go out with him and things. Among these women were Madonna and unnamed actresses, and of having not only a mistress but 3 other girlfriends. The reporter to whom he spoke found the episode farcical, and she and others have noticed his long-standing habit of trying to work the press, calling reporters to promote himself and threatening them if they were at all critical. As one expert on narcissism explains, narcissists obtain very little enjoyment from life other than the tributes they receive from others, and feel restless and bored when the external glitter wears off and no new sources feed their self-regard. For those of you who know this work, this is Otto Kernberg, who I think is the most brilliant student of malignant narcissism. Speaking of glitter, does anyone do glitter better than Trump? This baron of bling lived in a 66th floor penthouse. Actually, the building is 58 stories tall, but he claims it's 68 stories tall. He can't even not lie about the height of a building. It's slathered in gold from the walls to the gold-rimmed candy bowls, sporting pillows embroidered with the Trump coat of arms and featuring a statue of Apollo above the marble fireplace. It's a decorator's worst nightmare, an aspirational simulacrum of the Sun King's Versailles, rendered in North Jersey Rococo. Think of here Tony Soprano. Then, of course, there's Mar-a-Lago, a faux Versailles valued at $200 million, twice what the Trump Tower penthouse would bring in, which features rivers of marble, carved stone, and gold leaf, $7 million worth of gold leaf on the walls alone, graced with glittering chandeliers, offensive to his outwardly more ascetic, old money neighbors. Trump, as is his wont, tussled over zoning restrictions with the town of Palm Beach, suing for $25 million over the height of his flagpole. Notice a theme here with the big button, which in the end lost 10 feet, but is still, of course, the tallest flagpole in town. Trump has been compared to Louis XIV, a man whose vanity was without limit or restraint, and in the estimation of his courtiers. Every bit the monarch's equal in arrogant, egotistical self-importance, Trump is as yet an amateur by contrast when it comes to self-comportment and dignity. And allow me to pause here to mark the absurdity of an American president and an absolutist monarch side by side in a mainstream news outlet. So here's one picture of Trump, and here we have Trump as the Tudor king. With Trump, all is external. There is very little depth, even by his own account. In interviews conducted in 2014, he shied from reflecting on his life and its meaning, saying, "No, I don't want to think about it. I don't like to analyze myself because I might not like what I see." It's not a stretch to see in his gilded homes a perhaps aspirational inner state concretized and made visible. If he's not God, then at least he's a close approximation. As Kernberg writes, in general, that is, narcissist relationships with other people are clearly exploitative and sometimes parasitic. You don't have to dig very deep on this criterion. Throughout the campaign, Trump was roundly condemned for stiffing hundreds of contractors and other vendors with whom he did business. And since the election, he's been labeled a grifter and scammer. From the relatively small time, like the owner of a small music business who sold him pianos worth $100,000 for his Taj Mahal casino in Atlantic City, but was only paid $70,000, and who said he felt really bad, like I'd been taken advantage of. I was embarrassed. That is, the person who'd been taken advantage of was embarrassed. That's a brilliant move on Trump's part. To the massive fraud that was Trump University, which employed a sales team that preyed on the elderly and uneducated to separate them from their money, and that prompted a class action suit that Trump settled for $25 million. And to the con to beat all cons is using the office of the presidency to enrich himself. In 2000, he boasted to Fortune magazine that it was possible, quote, that I could be the first presidential candidate to run and make money on it. In 2016, a Republican election lawyer who had worked for Mitt Romney said there's a good chance that Donald Trump's the first candidate for president who makes money off the whole endeavor. No opportunity to cash in on the campaign trail was too insignificant, from paying his own company for using his planes to travel around the country to the tune of $5.5 million, to renting out Mar-a-Lago to his campaign for $423,000. Trump's self-aggrandizing prophecy looks on track to be fulfilled many times over. He has spent $93 million, the government has spent $93 million at Trump properties since the election, hosting, all of which ends up in his pockets, or some portion of which does. He has resisted all calls, including from the Trump-friendly Wall Street Journal, to build a wall between his personal and business interests and those of the office. And just as a sign of the kind of erosion of norms, this has basically been forgotten by this point. But there's more. It's not just that Trump has been fleecing Americans monetarily, it's also that his entire campaign and presidency is premised on exploiting the economic and racial anxieties of a large swath of the population who have been left behind as the incomes of some have risen since the 2008 financial crisis. Promises to bring back coal, steel, and manufacturing jobs, to build a wall along the southern border and make the Mexicans pay for it, to erect tariff barriers punishing the Chinese, among others, to purify the nation by banning Muslims and deporting millions of Mexicans, not only bad hombres, but also the undocumented, in short, to restore America's greatness. Much of this will come to naught because it doesn't serve the plutocrats with whose interests his own are allied. Of this, former New York mayor and billionaire Michael Bloomberg had this to say: I'm a New Yorker and I know a con when I see one. The richest thing about Donald Trump is his hypocrisy. I could spend hours detailing the many ways in which Trump has exploited all and sundry. Suffice it here to say, in Kernberg's exclamation regarding the malignantly narcissistic personality exemplified by Trump, it is as if they feel they have the right to control and possess others and to exploit them without guilt feelings. And behind a surface, which is often charming and engaging, one senses coldness and ruthlessness. So focusing on Trump's character is unlikely to result in his impeachment, yet it can shed some light on one of the puzzles that continues to stump commentators, namely, how is it that a staggering 63 million Americans voted for this man with no political experience, a man roundly judged to be unfit to hold office, who broke just about any and every political norm? And why have a goodly proportion of his supporters stuck with him, driven not only by expediency, though expediency is certainly in play, but more interestingly, by what is by all accounts an utterly implacable, unperturbable belief in him and what he represents? So here it's useful to look at the appeal of Trump's narcissism, not the liabilities with which we are more familiar. Trump mobilizes his own narcissism, and this will be my argument, the most important part of my argument here today. He mobilizes his own narcissism, which we can see in his charisma, grandiosity, and sense of entitlement, to connect to his followers and to effect their willing submission to him. Many have pointed to the bonds he has forged with supporters, which have yielded him a constant stream of adulation. And it's worth noting that he is a master exploiter of opportunities afforded by a rapidly changing media environment. Trump has held out to his loyal enthusiasts the promise of participating in his greatness. The deal struck many of the nation's disenfranchised and aggrieved have sworn allegiance to this larger-than-life figure who they feel understands them and their struggles. They have been unfazed by his performance in office, notably his occupying rather than draining the Washington swamp, and they continue to declare their unwavering support of him to puzzled print and television journalists. And there's a whole genre of articles where someone goes out to the heartland and interviews Trump supporters and writes the same thing. Basically, I don't understand why they still support him. Neither psychiatrist DSM nor research psychologist construals of narcissism can help us understand this. Both of these focus on the condition's liabilities to the exclusion of any of its upsides. And it's these upsides that have been missing from the conversation and that hold the key to making any sense of Trump's character and what it means for us and for his followers. Consider the ways in which even psychiatric and psychological experts have been stumped by Trump. Some argue that labeling him a narcissist offends not only ethical precepts prohibiting diagnosing at a distance, but also common clinical sense. Sure, he looks and acts like a narcissist, but he's not suffering and not impaired. After all, as he's reminded us, he's the president and we're not. Distress is a key criterion in diagnosing personality disorders, according to the DSM, and these clinicians argue, while we might be feeling it, that is the distress, Trump certainly is not. However much he looks like the stock narcissist, we'd be wrong to label him as such. Clinicians' reasoning varies. Psychiatrist Alan Francis, who is still peddling this line, who wrote the DSM criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, argues that Trump is a narcissist but doesn't meet the criteria for diagnosing narcissistic personality disorder because he's neither stressed nor impaired, a distinction without a difference in the public debate. And psychologist Keith Campbell, who was one of the authors of the Narcissism Epidemic, blithely brands an entire generation of millennials as selfish, entitled, navel-gazing narcissists, but he demurs when it comes to the celebrity-obsessed billionaire president on the grounds that Trump's functioning pretty highly. So this is Alan Francis's book, which basically has got some coverage, but the coverage has mostly focused on this book, edited by Brandy Lee, a psychiatrist at Yale, who was actually brought in by, I think it was 10 Democrats and 1 Republican to talk about Trump, the state of Trump's mental health. And she's now arguing that he has the capacity to wipe out the entire human race. Focusing on Trump will really drive you crazy, although I think she's not wrong in that. This book has got a tremendous amount of play, especially in the last 2 days with the publication of the Wolf book. Many a layperson consulting the DSM has surmised that Trump's behavior and temperament conform to psychiatric descriptions of pathological narcissism. And more than a few articles have presented the DSM's 9 criteria for diagnosis, side-by-side examples drawn from his actions, speeches, and Twitter feed. The exercise is pretty easy, especially given Trump's extensive record of grandiose, self-assessments, as well as his preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success and power, his interpersonal exploitativeness, his conviction that others envy him, and his lack of empathy. All are readily grasped. By these DSM criteria, Trump is a living, breathing textbook of character disorder, meeting just about every criterion in the literal book. Yet, and here's the problem, this DSM narcissist is an altogether repugnant character, and reference to it can't help us understand why anyone, let alone the 63 million voters and the 34 to 38% of the electorate who still stand behind Trump, would be drawn to such a person. What's the attraction of the grandiosity, the entitlement, the devaluing, the boasting, and the exploitativeness? The DSM's narcissistic personality disorder can account for why people might fear Trump and his vindictiveness, that is, the negatives of his character, but cannot explain why anyone would flock to him with the sort of abject devotion seen in some of his followers, the positive, appealing aspects of his character. Nearly everyone commenting on Trump's alleged narcissism, the press, clinicians, political commentators, has focused almost entirely on its downsides. But doing this leaves a lot of what's most useful about the category of narcissism on the table. And narcissism is a remarkably protean concept. It's really hard to grasp the whole of it. I spent 10 years writing my book on narcissism. It just about killed me getting it because it means so many different things. And I think that you have to take account of that because that is the power of the concept in its proteanness. In clinicians' hands, it refers to a broad range of behaviors and dispositions, and it encompasses traits that are desirable, such as ambition and self-confidence, as well as despicable, such as ruthlessness and grandiosity. It's an epithet in popular parlance, but it also refers to a neutral quantity of self-feeling. In some psychoanalytic construals, it's basically interchangeable with self-esteem. That is, it fluctuates day to day, as well as, confusingly, to a seriously disturbed yet often high-functioning type of person. So it's incredibly confusing, yet everyone's an expert on narcissism. In an age when a Google search of the term will yield you 10 million hits, where on the internet you can take the 40-question NPI that promises to gauge your narcissism, and when you can play amateur psychiatrist tallying Trump's symptoms alongside the DSM checklist. But if everyone's a narcissist, if everyone's an expert, all this expertise, including that found in the DSM, can't explain Trump's appeal. To understand this, we have to look at another way of thinking about narcissism. And this way encompasses the negative traits associated with narcissism, while at the same time giving narcissist appeal its due. And it focuses on the charisma and charm that enable narcissists to extract from adoring acolytes the admiration that sustains their sense of self. This understanding of narcissism is rooted in psychoanalytic thinking and can now be found throughout the literature of leadership, but it's largely missing from popular discussions. And it's indispensable, I argue, to understanding Trump. After all, unappealing narcissists pose little threat in a democratic political system. Few people willingly tie their fortunes to a monster. It's the successful and beguiling narcissist, the one who flatters, seduces, and finally enslaves you into mirroring his greatness and feeding his bottomless appetite for approval, who is the danger. Such individuals have been called productive narcissists. Trump's personality is similar to those, in the estimation of a writer on productive narcissism, to those of charismatic leaders who emerge in times of turmoil and uncertainty, when people are ready to follow a strong leader who promises to lead them to greatness, as in Make America Great Again. Such leaders are aggressive and not easily intimidated, as Freud wrote in 1931. They are possessed of a change-the-world personality that many people find attractive. You won't find this narcissist in the DSM. Then again, psychiatry and the DSM don't own narcissism, even though much of the conversation about whether or not Trump can be diagnosed in the public sphere has focused on psychiatry and the so-called Goldwater Rule, which prohibits members of the American Psychiatric Association from diagnosing someone they have not examined. I will point out that, however, Alan Francis, who is a member of the APA, who has not examined Trump, diagnoses him as not narcissistic, which somehow passes muster. The question then becomes less, is Trump a narcissist, and more, how does Trump mobilize his narcissism, connect with his followers? Many studies of leadership start from the premise that a successful leader will be, by definition, narcissistic, visionary and charismatic, while at the same time ruthless in pursuit of his own aims. And Trump is basically this leader. Like others of this sort, he's a figure of fascination, obsessive interest, and intrigue. Just look at how much time all of us waste reading about Trump on the internet. He's able to conscript others to join his grandiose visions and to lull them into submission, to extract awe and devotion from people. The news media routinely falls victim to Trump's charisma, even as various outlets engage in self-flagellation for doing so. During the campaign, they could barely take their collective eyes off Trump, such that he enjoyed, it is estimated, around $2 billion in free coverage. Trump exploited this, explaining, "I just don't think I need nearly as much money as other people need because I get so much free publicity. I get so many invitations to be on television. I get so many interviews if I want them." Virtually every day, he threw the media a bone in the form of an outrageous or offensive claim, and virtually every day, the media gnawed on it, lamented it, analyzed it, and most importantly, showcased it. Now, there are, of course, no leaders without followers. It is Trump's gift to make others feel that he values them, even as he flew around the country in his own 757 and sat atop Fifth Avenue in his own little Versailles. Charismatic leaders excel at apprehending and even exploiting the often unarticulated needs of those they would dominate, and we can see in this something of Trump's success. Any successful leader reflects back what people need, with the charismatic narcissist more dangerously endowed with the uncanny ability to exploit, not necessarily in full awareness, the unconscious feelings of subordinates. Perhaps no narratives were more common through the campaign than, first, Trump cares about me, and second, he is offensive, of course, but he's only saying what I think. As one supporter recently explained her vote for Trump, he says the things out loud that I say to myself. So here's Trump, too much focus on this, I think, narcissism as self-aggrandizement, and not enough on this. And I spent an ungodly number of hours watching YouTubes of Trump campaign rallies, and he is just a brilliant speaker. He really knows how to engage a crowd. How then did Trump convince the proverbial little person that he actually cared about him or her? We can begin to answer this by looking at how he invites people to identify with him and to share in his omnipotence and power. His braggadocio and rule-breaking incite envy among those who have little to boast of and who feel imprisoned by their circumstances. Now, the sharing is, of course, illusory. No amount of speechifying is going to launch the little guy into the economic stratosphere that Trump lives in. But he has some awareness of what he's doing. As he wrote in his best-selling Art of the Deal, "I play to people's fantasies. People may not always think big themselves, but they can still get very excited by those who do. That's why a little hyperbole never hurts. People want to believe that something is the biggest and greatest and most spectacular. I call it truthful hyperbole. It's an innocent form of exaggeration and a very effective form of self-promotion." So Trump promises and projects self-transcendence. Says one 86-year-old woman from small town Pennsylvania told a reporter after the election, "I think he touched something inside of a lot of people, maybe even something that they didn't know what it was," which I think is a really interesting way of talking about this genius he has. Not stable genius, but the other kind of genius for working the crowd. She added, "I don't like authority. I don't like people breathing down my neck," giving voice to the something intangible yet powerful that Trump holds out. And I think his rule breaking here, that he doesn't respect authority, is something to be emulated in this way that he connects to people. He also offers himself as a remedy for powerlessness. He points to his followers' marginalization and humiliation. So at one rally, "We're tired of being the patsy for like everybody. Tea Party people, you have not been treated fairly." Then he declares himself their tribune. "At least I have a microphone where I can fight back. You people don't." Finally, he shares his power with them, telling the crowd, "You don't know how big you are. You don't know the power you have." Trump's speeches are full of fights won and clowns and losers humiliated by his take no prisoners combativeness. So in this, he promises respect to people who have none. He's also a master at performing intimacy. His engagements with his followers is direct, either at mass events or by way of Twitter, which he has likened to have his own free newspaper. He disdains the media as corrupt and dishonest, skirting them by connecting at all hours with a continuing barrage of tweets by bombastic, hyperbolic, and pugilistic, filled with unsubstantiated claims and outright lies, and expressive of intense negative emotion. So I pulled one from 2013 before the last 2 days. Sorry, losers and haters, but my IQ is one of the highest, and you all know it. Please don't feel so stupid or insecure. It's not your fault. His son, Donald Jr., said, I mean, he's so authentic, adding the fact that his father writes his tweets himself is actually what makes him the great candidate he is. Trump himself sees genius in his tweets. I mean, you will read some of the stuff. There is genius there, he said. You have to find the right genius, but it is a powerful thing. I would argue there is genius in this. His apparent authenticity, his lack of the usual filters, it's likely both indicative of his cluelessness and somewhat strategic, meant to distract and inflame, or at least it has the effect of distracting and inflaming. His constant rule breaking is engaging and dramatic and invites identification with him as a sharer of secrets and a speaker of truths that cannot be expressed. Psychoanalysts have understood how powerful this sense of direct access to the mind of another is, the feeling of being part of the intimate workings of another person's mind, and how powerful this can be in nurturing identification of the sort we can see among Trump's followers. And for those of you interested in psychoanalysis, this is an argument that's been made for some of the organizational difficulties in psychoanalysis, in that every aspiring psychoanalyst must immerse themselves in Freud's dreams, in his interpretation of dreams, and take those dreams on in some ways as their own and become part of that inner world that creates an identification that is very hard to disrupt. I think something similar goes on with Trump's kind of openness. There's no secrets. Trump in his lifestyle can appear aspirational. It's been said that he's a poor person's idea of a rich person, and in his lifestyle exemplifies beer taste on a champagne budget. We learn now that he eats at McDonald's, not so much for the beer taste, but because he's paranoid about being poisoned, whatever. His aspirational appeal also lies in the abandon with which he asserts his dominance and the ease with which he inhabits power. He invites others to identify with his aggression and independence of norms. Explaining his bankruptcies, he told a crowd, "You have to use the laws to your advantage. What did I do to that bank? I should get credit for having the vision that things were on the decline. I made a lot of money in Atlantic City." He declared bankruptcy. Many of his supporters responded favorably to this, seeing in his record of bankruptcies evidence of his independence and dominance. As one middle-aged woman put it, the important thing is he doesn't need their money, so he's independent. Trump's pull on his followers can also be attributed to the ways in which he touches and mobilizes very primal emotions, such as anger, hate, disgust, intolerance of the other, and racism. And I was reading something that Wolf wrote online today, in which he called out Trump for thinking emotionally, not strategically. I actually think that this works to Trump's advantage, that he thinks emotionally. He's very connected to people's primal emotions. And he's able to link such emotions, as well as his own primitive fantasies of total and absolute control, to his followers' own primitive strivings. Or you might say they're narcissistic strivings that they have relinquished as life has beaten them down and passed them by. Bound together by the vague but powerful ideal of making America great again, Trump's followers handed their egos over to him, adopting a position of willing submission and becoming susceptible to his commands and directives. Think here of his repeatedly engaging crowds in symbolic acts of expulsion. At his rallies, he would yell out variously, "Get him out," throw them out in the cold, knock the crap out of protesters, take their coats, throw them out in the cold, directives that the crowds fulfilled. And there's video you can watch of crowds beating up protesters at his rallies. Trump famously commanded his followers to pledge their support for him, instructing them to raise their right hands in a gesture many likened to a Nazi salute and to swear to vote for him. When confronted with the resonance of the Nazi salute, he claimed not to know it was a problem. This is all straight out of the psychoanalytic textbook. They submit in order to preserve their love of the leader. And whatever esteem they experience comes from the sense of devotion to the ideals and causes established in the leader's image. Trump's fantasies and primal emotions are openly on a display in a way that those of no other American president have been. Think of his brutality. Mocking a disabled reporter, a war hero, Gold Star parents, threatening to lock up his opponents and to, quote, gut Megyn Kelly, who was a Fox News commentator. Her employer had to explain to Trump's lawyer that if she gets killed, it is not going to help your candidate. Promising to reinstate waterboarding, he said, torture works, believe me, it works. He proclaimed to an audience of retirees who laughed and applauded his tough guy stance. Of course, it's bad, but it's not chopping off heads, folks, he said. And minimizing police brutality against black men while blustering, one of the first things I'm going to do is get rid of those gang members whom he characterized as tough dudes. Trump taps into the inner brute. And again, his speeches are full of fights and clowns and losers. In sum, if we are going to make use of the concept of narcissism in understanding Trump, it's worth focusing on the intensity of the connection he has forged with his enthusiasts. Even those who, as one said, know that Trump doesn't give a shit about me or almost anyone else. This connection has confounded journalists from the beginning of his campaign and continues to do so. Many of his supporters don't care that his relationship with truth is shaky and opportunistic. They don't care that he trades in anger and hate and that he invited violence against his enemies. They don't care that he as much as admitted to sexual assault. The difficulty in explaining Trump and his appeal lies in the fact that he's prevailed, not despite, but because of all of the lies, anger, contempt toward losers, intolerance of dissent, and bombastic grandiosity. His flouting of just about every political, social, and sexual norm has only enhanced his appeal. His narcissism is a resource for and not an impediment to his political success. So I'm almost at the end here, but I want to talk for a minute about the narcissism and the businessman president. So for the last 2 decades at least, narcissism, or 4 decades if you want to start with Christopher Lasch's book, narcissism has been roundly condemned in American popular commentary and professional social science, considered a debilitating and even dangerous form of pathology. Yet in the business realm, the corporate realm, narcissism has been treated as a uniquely valuable dimension of personality. Commentators are united in condemning narcissism in millennials, as I alluded to at the start. Yet that narcissism is virtually a requirement to become head of a company, as a Forbes columnist put it in 2006, is current wisdom in business and academic business circles. Experts advise variously that, quote, narcissism may be your business's best friend, that some level of narcissism is critical in leaders, and that anyone who hopes to lead should have a healthy dose of narcissism. A Harvard Business Review writer recently lamented that we keep hiring narcissistic CEOs, highlighting such leaders' well-documented and widely commented upon destructiveness, and argued that the world around us becomes a better place when we install humble, unassuming people in positions of leadership. But such appeals to common sense and decency are no match for what sociobiologists tell us is our preference, hardwired into us, for the narcissist brand of glitzy despotism, which we are told testifies to the survival of still powerful, archaic, and masculinist prehistorical archetypes of the leader that underwrite our vulnerability to his allure. The emergence of the CEO as narcissist, or at least of the widely celebrated preference for him, was not an accident, The links between narcissism and leadership were produced over a course of 5 decades by psychoanalytic observation and by psychological science, disseminated in professional publication and popular venues. If you check out any airport bookstore, the business section is bursting with advice to the anxious, reproduced and endlessly replicated in a growing body of studies. An army of executive coaches, upwards of 30,000 in the United States by one recent estimate, helps aspiring corporate leaders enhance their bright side narcissistic traits, schooling them in visionary boldness, in taking risks, and in showing that you are inspirational and exciting, while helping them also temper their dark side grandiosity. We can see Donald Trump as the apotheosis of the narcissistic celebrity CEO. Significant numbers of those who supported him cited his experience as a good businessman to account for their preferences. Many invoke character traits that researchers would consider narcissistic, like the one who wrote to a reporter, "I am of the belief that he is conceited and arrogant enough to avoid failing in front of the world at all costs." And another who said, "He will expect greatness from us. He will tell us how to get great. He will inspire people to do better than they are." And yet another who predicted, "He will take a management approach similar to Steve Jobs, the ultimate signifier of the abusive yet productive boss." This man added, "It's not pretty, but it works." Left out of this, of course, is that Steve Jobs actually had some genius. Stable genius. These sentiments are straight out of the Narcissistic CEO instruction manual. Given the alternatives, Trump is a low risk, high reward, a gamble worth taking, writes the compiler of these quotes, channeling his informant's perspective. Yet another voter wrote what could serve as the introduction to this Narcissistic CEO manual. He leads an enormous, diversified organization that is worth billions. This requires leadership. When you lead a large organization, you set vision, goals, expect results. You delegate and empower. Ford Business Week and the Harvard Business Review could hardly dissent. And Trump, despite his record of failed businesses, really benefited from this perception that he was the narcissistic CEO, successful businessman. So to conclude very briefly, if we are to speak of the narcissistic self of modernity, then I would argue we should entertain or offer a more complex conception of the narcissistic self or selves than has been out there in the public conversation. As I suggested, it's easy to focus on the liabilities of narcissism, on the ways in which grandiosity, entitlement, and exploitativeness can shade over from successful leadership into crash and burn leadership, but that these can only go so far in explaining why narcissists succeed, why they rise to power. To understand this, we need to take into account the attractions and the appeal of narcissism and of the narcissist. And it is these that make the narcissist in power a dangerous threat to the body politic. And I'll end there. Thank you. We take questions?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Questions, comments, concerns? Yes, Jose.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy that you emphasized the functionality of the successful aspects of narcissism and did not linger on the pathology. But I have 3 concerns with your presentation. Because listening to you, you stress the promise of self-transcendence, respect, intimacy, openness, independence, primal emotions, the whole series of things that Trump projected and successfully projected. But this raises the question why these attributes were so important in American elections at that point. Many leaders are narcissists. Not all of them are narcissists in the same way. This is a very particular brand of narcissism. So the first question would be, why did this particular brand of narcissism have such an effect at this particular juncture?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a way, what I'm asking you is whether you could put your psychological analysis in a broader social context,
Mm-hmm.
which, because from your presentation, it sounded a bit like this is how you win an election. But it isn't always, and it wasn't always, but at this juncture it was. So, my first concern is social context, and my next concern is Trump did not only win, he won against another candidate.
Yeah.
Now, the other candidate certainly did not project self-transcendence, respect, intimacy, openness, independence, and primal emotions. You can say many things about Hillary Clinton, none of them, I think, can be said. So, of these. So, there was a very, very stark contrast. Do you have any explanation of why at this moment in which there is such a tremendous contrast between what these two candidates projected, Trump could have such an effect? And all the three concerns are connected. So my question is, what about the other candidate? So that would be the second concern. Not only looking at Trump, but also at the one who lost. And the third concern is Trump won after 8 years of Obama.
Yeah.
So, in a way, I'm asking about all the things that fall out of the horizon of this kind of psychoanalytic analysis. If I look at the Trump electorate, and I would attempt a social analysis of their psychological needs, this would bring me back to Obama.
Yeah.
So I think an analysis that focuses only on Trump, in a way, falls into the Trump trap. And so I would like you to enlarge on your horizon.
Okay. Well, thank you. Those are great questions. And I should say, I don't think that a psychological analysis suffices. It's what I do, but I do think we need a much broader analysis of the context, as you point out correctly. So why at this point? First of all, I don't think other leaders are narcissistic in some of the same ways. I think that and I didn't focus a lot here, but I've looked a lot into the kind of primal emotion stuff. I think that he is really an outlier on that. The disgust, the contempt, and this gets to Hillary Clinton, the disgust for women's bodies that he talked about a lot. There was one debate where she was returned late because the women's room was further away, and he referred to that, to blood coming out of her whatever, for Megyn Kelly. He's apparently very disgusted by bodily fluids, especially women's bodily fluids. And I think that's something that you don't see in other narcissistic leaders. I mean, any American president, almost any American, has been labeled a narcissist by the internet. And I think that the sort of DSM psychoanalytic narcissist, that would work for a lot of leaders. I think the more difficult thing to talk about with Trump is this kind of the anger, the hate, the disgust, the humiliation, all that. And I think in there, he really, he's so open about his disgust and contempt and kind of feeling like bodies are gross, and he kind of taps into something I think very primal. So I think he does differ in that way. But right, so why Trump at this point? I think I think there's a lot of anti-Obama. We gave the black guy 8 years. We're going to undo, and Trump is committed to undoing everything Obama did. The visceral hate for Obama is just remarkable. Anything Obama did, and the idea that a black man was in the White House, I think, explains a lot. There's just racism that runs through so much of what he does and what he talked about in the campaign and what he does as president. So the other candidate, well, she was a she to start with, and I think there's a lot of criticism of Hillary for being cold and distant, and she wasn't charismatic.
She got more votes.
She did get more votes, but she lost. I mean, she should have won. Yeah, she should have won. I mean, she ran against a rank idiot. She should have won.
That's a different question.
yeah, she should have won, and she didn't win. So I think, you know, we can argue about the Electoral College and so on, but she didn't win, and we got this guy as president who everybody knows is not fit to be president. She was extremely competent. I just read an article on my Twitter feed about Kirsten Gillibrand, which is a New York senator, who was argued she's too opportunistic and, I don't know, aggressive or something, some male comments. And the Twitter sphere is like, wait a minute, what politician is not opportunistic and aggressive? Like, there's a different standard for women. I think there was a huge amount of sexism. And I also think Hillary didn't help herself, taking all the money from Goldman Sachs and so on. But I feel like Trump was able to mobilize a lot of racism, and the outbreak in racist talk since his election, like giving license to say what formerly couldn't be said, I think is remarkable. And a lot of sexism, too. So, I mean, I don't have the, like, why Trump now? I think the Republican Party has been preparing the ground for Trump for the last 20 years, since the 90s, that kind of went off the rails with Clinton's election, shutting down the government, Gingrich, contract with America, and so on, and has become increasingly ideological and setting up the grounds for the emergence of a figure like Trump. But I think he has far outdistanced anything anyone thought was possible. And every day we're confronted with that. So, inadequate answers to your great questions. Thank you.
Good job.
I love your talk. I love it, and it's also just scary to hear all of this together. And I think you shed a lot of interesting light on thinking about and everything that he stands for, and the quotes really work very well and just fascinating. So thank you. So thinking within this kind of mode of thinking that you presented, and also Jose's question, I think it's interesting to maybe think of different regimes of affect, right, that Obama and Hillary are representing. Let's say that they represent rationality and level-headedness, and, you know, cool Obama, so rational, and, you know,
he got so much trouble for that when he was president.
You have Trump, who is really, like, you know, constant temper tantrums,
Right.
and with really kind of characterizing this transgression all the time. He's all the time saying the worst thing that you could possibly imagine, and to say to everyone, right, to veterans and women, and it's like, right, and if you do think of it as somewhat connected also to the logic of fascism, that those, you know, people in the 40s talk about this enjoyment of transgression, right? Related to, of course, people who were much worse than Trump, but they talked about this celebration of transgression of all, you know, the foundation of society. So I just wondered if you could, like, talk about the affect.
I'd like that idea. That
regime of affect, and I think there's a lot of enjoyment in that, right? Like, people, like, we supported really enjoy that, you know, you stick it to Hillary. And, you know,
Oh, I think there's so much to that. I think it's and there's some psychoanalysts who wrote about, from Berlin, who emigrated to the States, who wrote about the crowd psychology and the charisma and the kind of just letting it all out like that. It's so powerful, and I think Trump has really enjoyed. You know, there's one analytic writer and business professor at Harvard, brilliant guy, Abraham Zalesnik, who wrote about the leader's inner theater and the connection that the leader, and it was never picked up in any of the other literature. And I think it helps us understand Trump, because he talks about the disturbed leader's inner theater, like the kind of just the primitiveness in a psychoanalytic way of that inner theater, and how it connects to the sort of unarticulated primitiveness of the followers. And I think there is something of that in the fascist rally. And Trump's rallies do look a lot like fascist rallies. I mean, people are getting beaten up. There's thugs. There's, you know, people. He didn't ask people to give a Nazi salute. He asked them to raise their hands heavenward, and they all went like this. So, and there's many instances of this.
It's like a live feed, right?
Yeah.
He's out of control, but yet in a very controlled and manipulated way.
And I think that is his genius. I don't think his genius is in his IQ. It's his an emotional IQ genius. But right, I mean, Hillary and Obama, like the constant critique of Obama is he's unflappable, he doesn't have any emotions. I mean, oh.
Hillary, right?
Yeah. She's a technocrat. She gives boring, long policy speeches. Trump has no interest in policy. Apparently, another anecdote from the Wolf book is that one of his handlers sat down to run him through the Constitution, which you'd think, any school kid could know. And by the fourth article, he's like, don't tell me anymore. I'm bored. It's like he knows nothing. So, but I like the idea of regimes of affect. I mean, it's very useful. Thank you.
No, tomorrow. John.
Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot. In your talk, I couldn't help with another term, which is demagogue.
Yeah.
And it made me think, one is, are all demagogues narcissistic? The other term relates to, one of the definitions of a demagogue is one who undermines the democratic process or representative government. And so it's part of the, I think I really enjoyed the kind of positive valence of narcissists for a leader. It's fascinating that that business leaders see, or for the narcissism is the business leader's best friend, but a CEO that's not a representative government or democracy.
Right. Right.
So the larger question is, do you think that part of Trump's the appeal of Trump among his supporters is that in the wake of, especially in the wake of Obama, in which a black man is elected president by democratic process, his followers have abandoned their faith, in a sense, in democracy and are choosing this narcissist demagogue.
I think there's a lot to that. I think you're right on the money there, because any number of quotes in the news articles were about people saying, I just want to blow things up, in so many words. Like, I don't really like Trump, but things aren't working, so I'm just going to throw a bomb in it and vote for him. And at least he'll do something, instead of the same old Washington stuff, which is what we're getting now, largely, is, tax cuts for the rich and so on. So I think, right, a kind of, just a kind of enjoyment of destructiveness. And that's where I think the primal emotions thing is so important.
Including and especially the destruction of the democratic process.
Yeah, yeah. And so why do people submit to that? And this is the question people keep asking, but I think that there's some pleasure in submitting, especially because Trump, he does kind of exemplify blue-collar taste. I mean, the women thing, I didn't even go into that. But his women are like Barbie dolls, right? I mean, they're just, and I found an article where some guys were interviewed and they were like, I want women like that in my office. These were like blue-collar small business owners, right? That is the ideal, like these women who are, and I think Wolf calls them his work wives or workplace wives. They're all gorgeous. They all wear the sleeveless, sheath dresses, perfectly made up. They're not real people in the way they look. They look plastic. And I think there's something really, they don't like leak out of places like Megyn Kelly and Hillary Clinton and so on. I think there's something really appealing about that. So, yeah, thank you.
On the other hand, you have Ivanka, who may in appearance resemble a Barbie doll, but I think anyone not taking her seriously would do so at their peril.
Yeah.
I was quite struck, as a digression to be sure, that she flies economy, which might appeal to many of us who just made the journey. Yes.
She doesn't have her own private jet?
Taken to task by someone several months ago on an airplane. This was not a photo opportunity or deliberately designed. She was flying economy with her cousins, or nieces and nephews. But can I ask, since I rudely took the stage, can I, is there any sort of rehab for narcissism? Apart from Trump's peculiar variety, is there any sort of consensus? I'm being totally serious.
No.
Because it is a disorder.
Yeah. So it's very hard to treat. And part of the reason it's very hard to treat is narcissists don't seek help. Because as long as things are going well, they don't need help. They're doing great, right? So.
I'm not expecting them to admit themselves, but.
So Otto Kernberg, so I don't know if people know who he is, but he's a brilliant New York analyst who, born in Vienna, a brilliant student of personality disorders. I took a training course of his manualized therapy. He's a psychoanalyst, psychiatrist. Transfers focused psychotherapy for NPD, for narcissism. So, narcissists are in treatment. Elsa Roningsam treats narcissists. They're very hard to treat because they don't feel the distress. The distress is distributed around. When narcissists tend to go into treatment is when things start not going well. So they get older and they start to deal with the ravages of age, although 71, he doesn't seem to be affected that much. It's very hard to treat narcissism. So the thing about personality disorders is they're thought of as kind of traits, lifelong traits, rather than states, which are you move in and out of. So a psychosis, that's kind of state disorder. Trait disorder. So when Alan Francis, a psychiatrist, says, well, Trump's not mentally ill, are personality disorders mental illness? That would be a question that psychiatrists would debate. So it's kind of fudging the issue right there. But yeah, no, treatment is very difficult.
And when things fall apart,
it can be disastrous.
There's a tendency to blame others.
Oh yeah, it's always someone else's fault. It's never your own fault. There are spectacular meltdowns of various narcissistic CEOs. There's a whole subgenre of crash and burn CEOs of American companies who do things like buy $6,000 shower curtains and so on and throw themselves lavish parties in Morocco and then are taken down by their boards, but who are doing great because they look so visionary and bold and creative and all the good sides of narcissism. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Yes, the gentleman with the beard in the ponytail. Yes, right there. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think it's a very important issue. And I want to make a short comment about first
Roger.
there. Why Trump and why now, actually.
Yeah.
And also I have something very, I really want to, like about your strategy. The whole idea of your strategy, what you're trying to imply. First, why Trump? So I think the answer basically in why 63 million people vote U.S. and stuff. So I think the answer, my idea, is that basically what across all you can say genders, ages, ethnical categories, whatever is technology. Technology. Everybody has cellular phones. Everybody has connection to Wi-Fi, to internet. This is something very common. Technology allows it. And what this causes is that a lot of people, they have their life is changing very fast, and they have and this goes back where you started, the self-esteem. So this kind of a new way of getting to know yourself. And you need new ways to overcome this distance from yourself. And I think that Trump is a good choice. Apropos your second question, why not Hillary? Of reaching to yourself. And like the old lady was saying, he has something that we don't even know that is there, but we're looking for something in ourselves. And Trump is there, his body, his filthy, he's speaking in this language, it's a lot about juice and this kind of thing people are looking for.
He seems real, and I think Hillary came across as too scripted.
Sorry, we're just...
we need to go fast. So I'll just say one more sentence about your whole strategy of presenting him as crazy narcissist, someone with treatment and so, or as a fascist or something. This is completely wrong from my idea, I would suggest. And I can later on, if you want to finish that, but I think the most important thing that you didn't mention was the connection between money and power, which I think the whole discussion, 1 hour or 1.5 hours, should be about this. Whether we the effect of a billionaire who is in the possession of power in democracy.
All right, I'm going to cut you short here. Sorry, Liz, go ahead.
Well, I would just say I'm not offering a totalizing explanation. And I don't pretend to be, although it might have seemed like that. I don't think psychology is the answer. I think it helps us understand. I think the answer is going to be politics. And that's the only answer. Like, when will the Republican Party decide to grow a spine and stand up for democracy? But and that gets to the money and power question. But I think there is room for trying to understand. People are hungry for understanding what it is about this character. And that's why there's so many articles about him and his narcissism. So I'll just say that.
Alier.
So if I can go back to the rehab question for a second. I think it's interesting. I mean, the rehab question is interesting, not just vis-a-vis the narcissist, but those who are influenced by him. And I thought, I was thinking when we were talking about Trump and his core supporters, I think that it's incredible and very interesting that we have in Italy, we have a Donald Trump 20 years in the future,
Right.
basically. And we can see I'm talking about Berlusconi.
Right.
And we can see that 20 years into the future, meaning 20 years after he came into power, into politics, and he has very similar dynamics, not only in his biography, but of course also
The media.
women,
Right.
the way he projects women, the way Italians want to have women like he has women, and of course he has this core of supporters that sticks to him 20 years later, despite political scandals,
Right.
financial scandals, scandals with prostitutes, and so on. And so it's incredible to me that after so many years, this core group of supporters that you mentioned in relation to Donald Trump, but which exists also for Berlusconi, is still there, is still supporting him, and he's now back ahead of elections in Italy, he's back at the top of the polls. And this is a bit incredible, and so the question that arises is there a rehab for the people who are influenced by the narcissists? What can change? Is there anything that can change your mind?
I mean, in general, I would say that people whose own narcissism has been injured are very vulnerable to the appeal of a narcissist. I mean, that's not me, that's Freud. And I think that's really true. But, you know, I think the rehab is going to come, one, as the election in Alabama showed, white women who voted 54% for Trump don't like the sexual assault, sexual violence scandals. So maybe there's some hope there that white Republican women. So he has to be, I think, contained. So he's got 34 to 38% of the electorate. It's not enough to win a national election. Just that core supporters. So I think the way the rehab will be being left behind. I mean, his rehab for his supporters was, I'm going to get you high-paying jobs, but that's been a complete con. The wages have not risen, and you know, just recently, all these companies were giving workers $1,000 bonuses and then turning around and firing employees. $1,000 bonuses to celebrate the passing the Middle Class Tax Act, and then firing employees. So I don't think there's going to be a rehab. I mean, renewable energy, maybe, you know, jobs and, you know, renewable energy instead of coal. I mean, there are small experiments going on around, you know, to retrain people to get them into high-paying manufacturing jobs. But that kind of, you know, high school education would get you, you know, the house and 2 cars and the wife and so on. That has been under assault since the 70s. And it's not coming back. And Trump, that was the vision that he was offering to people was, you know, I can bring back that America. And it's not coming back. So
Elizabeth Dalton?
Yeah, I wanted to get back to the second part of your talk, which I think is the most fascinating, namely the supporters. Because I think, and I partially answered my question, I'm also picking up on your question, why did the supporters respond that way now? I actually have a friend who voted for Obama the first time round and voted for Trump this time round.
I know several people.
What has happened? What is the difference? Because you talk about the raw emotions, about the racism, the sexism that you tap into all of this. Are you saying the nation has become more racist, more sexist, more interested in raw emotions, or at least those parts of the country that made a difference? I mean, we don't hear about New York and California. So I want to, because I have myself been grappling with this, and it seems to me that the appeal of the narcissist, and perhaps partially because he's appealing to wounded narcissists themselves, so I think this may indeed have to do with the whole narcissistic culture of the last 15 years as well. But can you say a little more why that would have so radically changed? Because when Obama was voted into power, so many people said, my God, yes, Americans, this is a great moment, we can rise to the occasion. And 8 years later, they sunk to the occasion. And there is, of course, an American history of this. This is not unprecedented.
Right.
I think people tend to forget that. The hate for the government, the desire to destroy democracy, brute violence, the 19th century, all the way to the Gilded Age is exactly that.
Right.
So,
there's a lot of questions there. So, but I think, well, first of all, the government, so the Republicans have been trying to reduce government to this so they can drown it in the bathtub since the 90s. So there's been an assault on the government and what the government does. And I think it's impossible to overstate the hatred for the Clintons and what they represented.
okay.
I think that's really, I think it's real. I think it's a real factor. And it goes back to Bill Clinton and just, this pot smoking, newer generation. So I'm not sure what the question is. Like,
The question is why the shift from 2008.
oh, I think
White.
So first of all,
men were willing to vote for a black man, and 8 years later they were.
so political scientists predicted that the party, they have their models, and a lot of them were shot to hell by the election, but there were predictions that, the party in power loses after 2 terms. And there's some of that. I think we could feel really good about ourselves in voting for Obama. A lot of Republicans voted for Obama. I know Republicans who voted for Obama. They felt like they, as you said, were participating in some kind of American kind of openness, founding creed and so on. I think the financial crisis is, I haven't mentioned that, but I think that plays a really important role, because what has happened since 2008 is that wealth inequality has kind of stretched out. Bankers and the rich have done extremely well in the wake of the crisis, and a lot of other people have not. A lot of working people have not done well in the aftermath of the financial crisis. So rising inequality is part of it, resentment, and so on. But the puzzle is how Trump, who claims to be a billionaire, who knows, managed to convince people that he was one of them and that he had their interests at heart, and still manages to do that, even though everything he does is for the plutocrats. So there's something more than just sort of rational kind of acting going on. There's some kind of very
interesting thing, the fact that Obama won a second term. It's not his first term. He won a second term. And that says it's hard to say that those people have now completely and totally changed. Something has changed. I'm not sure it's that. You can say, well, first time he won, accident, or they wanted to feel good about themselves. Recession, okay, deep crisis. He did win a second time. So the same people. It's all the same places.
Yeah, no, I know. I don't think anyone has the explanation. I mean, there's a lot of different explanations. I don't think we have we don't know.
You want to follow up on that?
Yeah, just pick up on this. Thank you very much for the talk. 2008 to 2016, I happened to live in the US during 2008. It was a tremendous experience, of course.
Best year to be right.
Tremendous experience. But from talks that I had with like regular voters, not intellectual, not academic, I got the notion that it was very, very emotional.
Yeah.
Not only emotional, the people were talking about Obama like he was the Messiah.
Right.
Like it was completely, he was just to be elected and everything would be okay with their lives, something like
Right.
that. And I think that, well, if we talk about, if we analyze this from a sociological, psychological point of view, so if we take some of the voters that are looking for an authentic self, present something different, something like a Messiah. So it's the same. It's just like
Right.
the two poles of the spectrum. But my question, if I may add this also, the question was about the authenticity that you raised. I think it's extremely crucial, extremely important. I was sitting here in my seminar 2016. All Israeli students, graduate students, and students said, of course, I would vote for Trump. Of course, he represents. Why I asked, I was very surprised. He speaks the truth. He
Yeah.
is authentic.
Yeah.
He is authentic.
He's authentic, yeah.
Maybe we should focus not on the narcissistic self, but on the authentic self. And an authentic self that sometimes, the narcissistic, when there's no one else, the narcissistic takes, rides on the effects on authenticity. Even if, in this case, the authenticity is false.
Well, I think, the authenticity,
Even if it's false.
I think the authenticity works at a very deep level around the expression of what I call primal emotions. Like, he's like me. Even though he's way up there, he's angry, he's upset. He's not just aspirational with the beautiful women and so on, but he has normal human emotions, whereas Hillary looked like an automaton. So I think there's something in the authenticity. I think you're right. But I don't see that as a total explanation. I'm not sure where that fits with the narcissism, but I think there was something about his realness and his unscriptedness, his just speaking from the firing off stuff that appealed. It's very appealing because people could think he's just like me.
Yeah, but
I can't hear people talking. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I think what I'm asking is is every narcissistic self or is an authentic?
Oh, I think part of the problem is narcissism means so many different things, and to my mind, the most useful way to mobilize the term is in the way that looks at both the sort of upsides, the positive sides, the charisma, the charm, the creativity, the ambition, and all those things that we want, allied with the liabilities, which is the tendency to go over the edge, to believe in one's own publicity, to devalue, and so on. Narcissism in the popular sphere, we've gotten much more serious about talking about it. Used to be just, using your credit card too much. Now people talk about Trump, talk about his entitlement, his grandiosity, his and the enviousness and so on, but they don't get to the upsides of it. But narcissism is also, like I said, it's just in psychoanalysis, it's just a quantity of self-feeling. It's like we all have narcissism. We need narcissism to do anything in the world. It's self-esteem. You have to feel good about yourself to do anything, to imagine that spending years writing a book is actually worth it. You have to have a pretty high sense of self to do that, to squirrel yourself away in your study for years to do that, or to work in a lab for years to try and make some world-changing kind of discovery. So in that way, it's a kind of neutral, it's kind of, our narcissism goes up and down. So it means so many different things. So I would not, I think narcissists come in, you know, every narcissist is his own kind of, is their own figure. I wouldn't make a statement that they're all inauthentic or authentic, or I don't think you can make those kinds of statements. But just to go back to something Elizabeth raised, I don't buy the Lash critique at all that we've become a nation of narcissists. I just think that if everybody's a narcissist, the term has no meaning. It's analytically useless. NPD, you know, severe narcissistic personality disorder, experts, APA estimates 1 to 6% of the population. Inpatient psychiatry, it's 15% maybe. So it's not everybody is a narcissist. There's a lot of non-narcissistic people who have narcissism, have self-esteem issues, but don't have this thing called narcissistic personality disorder. So really confusing to sort out all the different meanings. But I would say, I wouldn't want to make kind of extra sort of prejudged formulations about narcissism, although I do think Kernberg has the best descriptions of narcissistic personality disorder in about 6 pages that you can find anywhere. And I've shown those to people who have been hurt by narcissists, and they're like, oh my God, you know, it's all there, right? So because one of the things narcissists do is they make you feel like they are so incredibly special, that they are the only one like this, that only they can solve all your problems. And I mean, if you're first around a narcissist, it's an amazing, like someone who's really skilled narcissist, it's an amazing feeling. Like, you never feel better in your life because they are really skilled at figuring out what will make you feel good, because then they go in for the kill and just suck everything out of you. It's a really interesting kind of dialectic there. Is that it?
All right. Now, there are a bunch of other questions, but it's nearly 6:30.
Oh, okay.
I feel bad for
I know,
your
I'm fine.
throat and the prospect of you losing your voice. So we will reconvene here tomorrow at 9. Not narcissism, but other topics no less interesting about the self and its context.
Oh, it's self-centered.
Yes, exactly. So thank you all for coming.
And thank you.
Professor
Thank you for your
Lunbeck.
comments.